Hi, and welcome to the Team Deakins podcast. This podcast is a dialogue between Roger and James Deakins, starting with a submitted question or topic and ending who knows where. We will also be joined by guests for some topics. If you'd like to submit a question, email it to webmaster@rogerdeakins.com. Composition is really, I think, really important and something I really love. And it really makes a difference to me in the movie if there's been some sort of thought towards it.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But it's such a complex subject, isn't it? Because how do you divorce composition from content, from script, from lighting, from...
True, but then, okay, so look at a movie like Loveless. Loveless was... the framing was so thought out on that, and I thought gave so much to you in telling the story just visually without dialogue. And of course, there's that wonderful scene when you pull back in the bathroom, I think it is, and see the kid in agony.
Behind the door, yes.
Yeah, which is...
Yeah, it's amazing shot. Then that's the thing. Are you talking about composition and shot construction or just composition? Because if it was just talking about composition, I'd probably remember the later shot in the film where you see all the kids playing in the park in the snow out the window. And that's a very striking composition because you're inside the room looking at the world outside, which is going on as it was before this boy disappeared and the people's lives changed.
Well, in a way, okay, so you have composition and still photography and painting and things like that. But still, when you're shooting a movie, you're choosing where you put the camera. You're choosing, as you said this morning when we were talking about it, whether their back is to camera, whether their front is to camera. And those all are essential for telling the story.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned still photography because, I mean, I've always referenced still photography, thinking about composition and content and position. But in a way, they're very different media. I don't think I'd have ever been a good stills photographer because a stills photographer has to capture a moment, but a film isn't that. It's interesting. I've been thinking about that a lot lately and not really come to a conclusion. But I think it's a different sensibility. And I've always found it very hard taking still photographs because maybe it's my relationship to something that's very immediate and real and finding that moment that expresses in one frame something that you feel around you and, 180 degrees, you're in a situation, you want to express it with a frame. And that's slightly different, especially from a film like Loveless, which is very considered. You can't imagine that he shot virtually any shot that wasn't in the final movie. I kind of think he works a lot like Joel and Ethan Coen work, that it's thought out, it's very precise. He shoots over long schedules, apparently. I don't know, I'd love to meet him, or Michael Krutchman, his DP, because it's interesting. It'll be interesting to know how they actually do come to the work they do, the shots they do,
But as a cinematographer, you are choosing where the camera is going to be. And as you said this morning when we were talking about this, it has to do with lighting in a way also, because what are you seeing in the frame?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing as well. A stills photographer is looking at something that they're not. I mean, I'm talking about a photojournalist, a street photographer. You're looking at something that you don't actually change. You can only capture, and only capture the moment by your positioning and the kind of light you shoot in, but you can't actually change it. Whereas obviously there's a lot more. It's a hard one. There's a lot more in cinema that is.
I think even relating to that, Roger, lighting and composition, it's two things that people really focus on when in cinematography. are you thinking about either of them first? Are you thinking about composition before you start lighting? Are you thinking about lighting in terms of mood and how you want to show a scene, and then figure out the frame and start composing a shot? Is there either or that comes first?
Usually it's the shot, I think. It's usually what you're doing with the camera. But it's interesting because there was a question on the website this morning about the idea that in the UK, the cameraman deals with the gaffer and the lighting, whereas there's two cameramen, basically. There's a cameraman dealing with the camera and operating the camera, and there's a cameraman dealing with the gaffer and the lighting, and they're separate. And that seemed to be some sort of tradition for a while in England, but I can't understand that because there's the two things are the same. Yeah, I can't understand. You can, it's like if you're taking a still photograph, you have to take the angle of the light, the nature and the quality of the light in mind when you position yourself and take a shot. And I think it's definitely the same things are combined in film. Do you shoot somebody silhouetted against the window, or do you shoot them against the window and then have to flat light them as if they were lit from inside? Because you don't want a silhouette. I mean, it's as simple as that, isn't it? I mean, you can't really divorce one from the other, and that's why, to an extent, you can't really divorce composition from lighting or camera movement.
And yet it's something that you really have to think about.
Yeah.
Because it's not just lighting. I think the stronger movies are the movies that tell you the story visually, not just the dialogue, but but by your choice of where you put the camera.
Well, I think that's really true. I mean, I just think of an extreme case where in Sicario, Denny, we set up a shot with the team had come back from crossing the border back from Mexico. And they had the drug dealer hooded in the background, and they all bundled out. And then there was a conversation between Emily and Josh that happened at the end of a take that was really set up for the action of them driving up and getting out. And we were kind of thinking we were going to go in for over its coverage. And we shot the shot, and Denny just let it play. The whole thing went on, and we just let it play without rehearsing the end of the scene. And yeah, we did it a couple more times. But I'm not sure if it wasn't the first take that was actually used. But it became obvious that was an incredible, interesting and powerful way to play that argument between those two characters. Because I remember saying to Denny, that was great, we've got that whole scene, but do you think we should go in for close-up and close-ups or overs? And he said, the trouble is if I do, then I might want to use them. So we didn't. So we moved on to the next section of work and actually got ahead in our schedule a little bit. And that, to me, that was a very extreme version, because the composition of that, if you look at it, is these tiny little figures and all the people have gone through the frame, and these two people are left empty with this big sky above them. It was kind of perfect. But, it was an instinctive thing on the day to do it that way.
Yeah, and a lot of times when you're shooting, I see you set up the shot, we rehearse a couple of times, and you say, oh, something's not right. And then I see you move the camera just slightly to a slightly different position, and it makes all the difference.
Yes, or change a lens. And that's the other thing with composition. It's related to the lens you use, because obviously the lens you use defines whether the viewer is close to the subject and aware of the background around them, or is a long way from the subject or further from the subject or character, and less aware of the background and the surroundings. So the lens has a crucial role in a composition. I mean, you look at the stills work of, say, Bill Brandt. I don't know if people know Bill Brandt from like the 50s, 40s and 50s, I guess. He, on the one hand, he shot coal miners, slogging home with their coal up in the north of England, and wonderful shots of Stonehenge in the storms and stuff. And then he shot these series of nudes on really wide lenses, not almost fisheye lenses, I guess. These distorted nudes. It was like two totally different styles of photography. So I kind of think of that as somebody using the medium, but in stretching it in different ways. One being very photorealistic, and the other being almost like a Dali sort of surrealism.
I guess backing up, even like when you get a script in your hands, or when a project you're going ahead, do you start visualizing with composition? And throughout when you're reading it over and over again, you're starting to think, oh, we can do this. I think this would be, I'd really like a tight frame here and somebody in the corner. Or are you waiting for a director, and are you waiting to get into those more deeper discussions, or are you really just starting from the get-go thinking of composition?
Not consciously. Thinking about it, because images appear in your head, I think. But it's a much longer sort of process, really. I think the first decision is the kind of feel of the film. Are you going to do what Bill Brandt did with the two extremes? Are you going to shoot it all handheld? Are you going to shoot it with a lot of mobile camera? Or are you going to, like 1917, which is an extreme, obviously? Or are you going to do something like a Robert Bresson movie, like The Man Escapes, where the camera just pans now and again, but hardly really moves. It's all done in cuts. And I think that's a kind of earlier decision than actually composition. You might have an overall kind of discussion about lens lengths. Like, I remember working with the Coens, and we'd done Hudsucker Proxy, and we shot the whole film on quite wide lenses. It was wanted to be not distorted, but kind of a pushed kind of environment, a pushed reality. But then the next film we did together was Fargo, and they wanted that to feel like a docudrama, really, a kind of like, this is a real story, and they wanted it to feel real. So we talked about shooting it on longer lenses, which basically we did, slightly longer. So I think that conversation comes before composition. Yeah, for me anyway.
So it's more of you're figuring out what suits the story from a big picture and what's most important before you start actually, specifically breaking down composition of frames.
I think you have to be that way too, because you don't really know what the blocking is until the actors come in.
And locations and everything. Mm-hmm. Working with Joel and Ethan, and they storyboard everything, and sometimes I'm involved, have been involved or not. But you would think that would nail down the composition of every frame. Well, no, it sort of points to it, but it doesn't completely lock it. You're still on the day, you're finding that composition and playing with it, But that's the nearest I've ever come to working with somebody where those compositions are worked out in advance,
I think sometimes under the stress of the day, let's make sure we make the day. Sometimes people just get into this head of, what have we put on film, on tape, whatever, what have we gotten in the camera, what do we have to do next? And they're thinking more in blocks of the scene. We've gotten this, we've gotten that, and they're not stopping to think, oh, how could I shoot this even better? Sometimes the stress of making the day can put you into that place.
Yes, and then you forget how either the scene you shot previously that you're connecting what you're shooting on that day goes with is ended in a wide shot, and then you start on a very similar composed wide shot or something, then you're in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
Or not. You might want that, but often it's not. No, you don't.
But even in movies where you talk in the beginning and you go, okay, we'll think out every transition. Let's think every transition. Yeah. You never do.
Yeah, no, it's true. But it probably is a good thing, because then it leaves you open to spontaneity. But I think it's good to discuss these things. So when you're doing something, you're aware of what you're doing a little bit more, how it relates to the rest of the overall kind of picture, the picture of the picture.
You talked about kind of the storyboarding and maybe some of the locations and sets. Is there ever a case where, either you're thinking of a shot specifically and they kind of design the set around that, or the opposite where you're limited by what they've given you and you have to knock out a wall and change the composition or do something where you really wanted, you had a certain image in your head, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that happens. Obviously, with the Coen brothers, you storyboard, and basically we are looking at locations or the sets being designed with those storyboards in mind. So there's less of that kind of make it work on the set sort of thing. But we still sometimes see a location or see an interior that we like and say, well, we'll shoot here, we'll make this work because we like it so much. Bob Rafelson once said, if they gave you everything, you'd be lost. You need some sort of restriction to be creative. That's what his thought was. And I probably agree with that. It would be awful if everything was too easy. I was going to say I prefer shooting on locations, but that's not necessarily true because it depends on the project. But
there have been many times where you've taken out that chainsaw and
yes.
Put a hole in the ceiling, even because you told them you needed a light coming through there.
Yeah, I've done that on films that have been storyboarded very closely, and I've done that on films that haven't been storyboarded at all. Yeah, I've still got the chainsaw out. Yeah, because sometimes you go, well, you see a shot and that's the way to get it. And obviously you don't chainsaw part of the set if it's going to be in shot in the next frame, that you do. But you got to be careful. But I mean, you do what you need to.
It is true that sometimes sets are constructed with the idea of what you're going to see and what you're not going to see, like the elevator and you're not going to see that time. Yeah. And certainly 1917, the whole thing.
Yes. I mean, I think that makes sense that, because you're always working on a budget, and no matter how much the budget is, you're still kind of trying to do more than there's ever there. And if you don't need the third wall or the fourth wall, then why build it? So but then a lot of production designers will go and say, well, I work with so-and-so and he changed his mind, so I better give them the whole set. But with Joel and Ethan, they don't really change their mind.
And it really does depend on the production, because a lot of times on a certain production, you're kind of finding it on the day. So you don't know if you're going to see that wall or not. You need to give it to them, because that's the kind of production it is.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You've got to know the director and trust that when they say they don't need it, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks later, when they're actually shooting on that set, they won't need it, Going
back to what Matt was asking, by the time you come on the set for the day that we're shooting that scene, in your head, because probably a basic blocking, do you have an idea of some of the compositions that you're looking for?
Yes. I mean, pretty well always. Back to Matt's point about reading the script. I mean, at a certain point, you start getting a feel of each scene. You start getting a feel of whether you're going to play it wide or an observational, or whose point of view you're going to play it from, and what does that mean compositionally. And then there's, obviously there's certain exterior shots you shoot where you're very aware of the kind of composition you want to go for, little figure walking across the harsh landscape, or you're going for a huge sky, or you're going for a lot of ground and then being top of frame. You kind of have those sort of things in your mind. Do you choose a location with a lot of verticals, like a forest with vertical trees, so you can do a side track, and that feeling of that gives you, you have all those things in your mind, really.
And how do you, when it comes down to it, you have the day of, and maybe now shooting digital, it's a little easier because people can see, but are you coming up with a frame and the director's saying, yeah, I like that, or can we move it this way? Or is the director saying, I think we need, granted this is without storyboards and maybe you're coming up with it on the day or the day before. Are you the first one to come up with what you think the composition is, or are you really waiting for someone else to give you that direction?
I don't know if it's just me and people are afraid of me or something, but I mean, it's always been my experience on set that you'll work with a director or the actors will work with a director first thing in the morning. And then you'll either be there or be brought in later when that director's feeling comfortable with the blocking. And then you'd have your say about the blocking, or not, depending on the director. But usually you have your say because you think, well, if somebody went over by the window, you'd get more chance to do such and such with the camera. And then you kind of work out the shots that are going to be the coverage of that scene. And you discuss it with the director, and then the director goes away and you start setting them up. And it works like that. I've actually, even with Joel and Ethan, maybe a little bit on Barton Fink when we first started working together, we'd look at a viewfinder and set a shot together. But I don't think we did much of that after the first film, because it was about then having trusted and everything. We just got on with it. And sometimes they come back and say, well, I think that maybe it should be on a longer lens, or maybe we don't need to see that much of such and such. Or, one time they said to me, that frame's too interesting. And I got what they meant. It was on Fargo. I wanted to keep a bit of a chair in shot or something to give the frame a bit of, close it in a bit. And they said, no, that's too interesting. And I got what they were saying, But it's usually, yes, we discuss the shot together, maybe with a viewfinder, and then I'll set it up. And
also, in the prep time, you've spent a lot of time talking with the director, and a lot of times when you're discussing scenes, you say, oh, well, it might be nice if we do this. So you've already had those kind of discussions to a degree.
Yes, usually you've had those discussions, yeah. But then you get a film like Jarhead or something, or even way back Sid and Nancy, and you basically put the camera on your shoulder and you talk about you could talk about how you're going to cover the particular scene or particular take of the scene, and then you just do it, and then maybe you discuss it afterwards and work on it for the next take. It's always different depending on the movie.
Generally, after you do the blocking and then you talk with the director about the shots, you are talking about, well, I'll probably do this and that. So the director, when he goes off set, kind of knows what you've got in your head. So it's no big surprise when he comes back. It's no big surprise.
He's not going to come back and find the shots totally different than it's been discussed and he envisioned. No. No, you're never going to do that. I mean, sometimes I'd be on a set and be setting a shot up and then think, no, we're missing something here. What if we did such and such? And then I'll ask the AD to ask the director to come back so I can discuss it with them,
Because sometimes when you're actually working on the shot while the director's away, you actually see something. You get an idea.
Yeah.
So bring him back on.
It can happen,
It can happen that you have an idea.
But usually, a lot of the times I just choose the lens and get on with it, Yeah, it depends on the director.
But I think for you, too, framing is fairly instinctual because when you're setting up the shot, you try it a couple of different ways, and when it's right, it's right. You know that it is.
Yeah, I think I can usually see it in my head, and then it's just a matter of finding that, tweaking it with the right lens and the right camera movement, the right positioning. It might be just a few inches to the left or right, and it make a lot of difference. Sometimes it's the old thing. You don't want a lamp growing out of somebody's head. I mean, it's not always that simple, but it's basically you're looking for those little things that disturb the eye, or if you want to disturb the eye, you're looking for those little things that do that.
It is amazing, though, how moving the camera just slightly to end up with a different end frame makes such a big difference.
Well, also, people say to me, well, isn't it, what do you mean there's a difference between a 32 and a 35? Why do you move the camera a few feet, or why don't you just change the lens? Or it's different. You move in on a 32, it's very different than staying where you are on a 35. It is. Just go and look at it. Try it. It's different.
So basically also if someone's asking how do I get this instinct in me? Wouldn't you say that looking at paintings, because that is one piece of composition, or still?
Yes, I mean, I think paintings are, certain painters. But then don't forget paintings, even my favorite painter, Edward Munch, it's very hard to tell what lens he's on because he's playing with a distortion.
True.
Parts of the frame are on a different lens.
Right.
And in a way, that's because he's trying to give a different emphasis to the clock in the room as opposed to the girl on the bed. You know, it's all a little bit shifted, which is what's kind of interesting about what he does, apart from anything else.
So would you say watching movies then and see what frames move you?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, you know, because the older movies were shot with fewer lenses. A lot of old movies in the 40s and 50s would have been shot with one lens. And so it's very much about moving the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you're not changing the perspective to the audience necessarily. How do you learn? You got to go out and do it, you know. You get a stills camera and get a stills camera not with a zoom lens, you know. You buy a stills camera and a few prime lenses. That's what I did anyway. But
Have you ever had a time when you're on set and you can't find the right frame, or something's frustrating you and you've had to walk away, or you just don't think you can make it work, or do you think there's always something there?
well, you can always do something. I mean, even if you don't like it, you can still do it and make it probably acceptable. No, you push yourself as much as you want to push yourself, don't you? I mean, you could have a formula and shoot every film the same, you know, put the character in the center of frame and always put the light, 45 degrees to the side so it's nicely roundly lit and, stick in a bit of backlight. They always like that. I mean, you could have a formula, but that's not necessarily satisfying you, is it? And surely, what are you doing it for? I'm doing it to satisfy myself, not somebody else. I'm sorry, I am. I'm doing it because I really enjoy it. I love playing with images, and I love seeing the effect that an image has within a story. So I'm doing it for myself.
Well, the thing about locations, too, is that sometimes you get stuck. You can't tear down a wall to get the camera further back to get the frame that you want.
Yeah. I mean, you can get in trouble. I mean, I was on a film, I was in trouble. I mean, I quit. Because we were shooting in this tiny house. And the only way to get a close-up was to shoot on a quite wide lens. And a particular actor said, I am not going to be shot on a lens wider than a 50. And I said, well, okay, somebody's got to work this out because, I could get a shot of your mouth on a 50, but I wouldn't get your eyes in at the same time. I mean, that's the size of the rooms we were in. So that was just stupid, but that was actually somebody without the experience of knowing that it was going to work in that space,
And as you were saying before, too, composition is sometimes how you place the person is the back to camera as opposed to the front when you might be expecting to see the face.
Right.
That's very strong.
Yeah, compositions, that is about eye line. It's about the angle of the character to the lens. And yeah, do you play an emotional moment on the back of the head, or do you pull front on, Yeah, that, I suppose, is composition as well. It's not really just whether, it's not like when Toulouse-Lautrec or Degas started cutting the frame, where you didn't see somebody's legs in a painting, and the first people that viewed these paintings apparently thought, where are their legs gone? That was really weird for them. Of course, that, you don't have that problem anymore.
Moving back, toward the beginning, we were talking about moving shots, thinking, when you're starting and ending, and if there's big moves or something like that, I mean, how precise do you have to be, or are you figuring out the exact composition you want throughout the whole frame?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I like to operate, because a lot of it's instinctive. I mean, if the actor's very slightly off their mark, not that I work with marks anymore, thank God. I mean, Andy doesn't, my the focus pull I work with doesn't really use marks anyway, so can't really refer to marks. But the actor's not exactly where you think they're going to be. Then I want to be the one making the decision how I frame them. And sometimes on a second take, I might frame slightly more different than the first take. If I know the shot is a oneer and there's not cuts involved. If you're doing cuts, it's really awkward to make the second or third take different than the first take. If you're doing coverage of a conversation and then the director wants to use a bit of the first take and a bit of the third take, then it's going to jump because suddenly that cut is going to be different. So, but if a shot's going to be oneer and it's just that shot that's what that piece of film is, then sometimes I'll play with the film, with the framing and be more extreme, and just see what feels right. So it's a lot of it's pre-thought. You have something in your mind. The director's got something in the mind. You've discussed it, and then there's that sort of instinct on the day.
Is there ever a time when you think you might have a stronger idea for composition, or the director's really challenging what you've put on the frame, and you guys kind of work to come up with a compromise, or do you fight for the shot that you think you have?
Yeah, there's a few times that I usually would fight for the shot that I feel is the best, but then at some point you have to stop, don't you? It's a director's choice. I mean, the worst thing, I've never really had such a problem with that, I don't think. The worst thing is when you're in the car going home and you think, oh, I could have done that better if I'd gone wider and unbalanced it or something. You always have other ideas.
You have to be able to compromise too, because it is a collaborative process.
It is. It's a compromise. I think what you do is you compromise as a cinematographer. Yes, it's compromise. You're not the director. So just get used to it. But that's fine, You work with people and hopefully they build mutual respect, and then you can understand their opinions and they understand yours, and find the director finds the best one. That's all you can really hope for. That's all I want. It's just to be kind of listened to, I suppose, given the opportunity to.
Yeah, if you don't have that dialogue with the director, it's pretty boring.
Yeah, if it just becomes a mechanical thing, then it's like, really?
How hard are you working to build composition before and pre-production? Are you pulling, like we talked about, the overall look of the film, but are you pulling specific images just for composition, just for lighting?
Tricky. That depends on the film. Certainly on a film like Jesse James, we had all kinds of references before we started shooting. We had references for every scene. We had the feeling of every scene down. The sort of color scheme, the kind of the quality of being observational, being tight. That was we had that in our minds before we shot anything. But some stuff we storyboarded extensively, but other stuff we didn't. But we still had a clear conception of each scene in our heads before we started shooting. Whereas, other films, you don't have that. You're doing it instinctively on the day when you see a blocking with the actors, or you see the light on a location or something. You can sometimes turn the whole action around the other way if you feel the light is going to be a certain way in a certain time of day.
Another element of composition can be what the focus is on, because, for instance, when we did Goldfinch, we had several shots where we put the focus on something unexpected, which really drove Andy crazy. But the main character wasn't in focus, who was speaking a lot, while another element was in focus.
Right. Absolutely. That obviously relates to composition in some way. I think in terms of the sort of overall compositional thing, in terms of sort of like your first feeling of what a film's going to look like, I think of Kundun, where Marty Scorsese wanted something fairly proscenium. He wanted the Dalai Lama, whoever was playing the Dalai Lama, to be in the central frame. He wanted a symmetry because it reflected the kind of, I suppose in a way, it reflected the spirituality of of their religion, of Buddhism anyway. And so we were creating something which was more kind of a picture book in that way. And then there was a certain, there's a certain lens length we went with on that film as well that had, so it had a sort of formality to it. And then, as I say, if I was talking about Hudsucker or you're talking a film like that, you're stretching it another way. And then sometimes, on a film like Prisoners, you're not playing a square frame. You're not playing
But what you did
symmetry.
What you did on Prisoners that was so interesting, and it came out of the fact that those locations were so small. It's about a story about people being trapped and all of that, and you're always shooting through a door frame. That's the only way to do it, but it worked out so well because it made everyone feel so enclosed.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. I like that sort of technique, really, whether you're shooting through a door frame or whether you're cutting a frame with an object. So the frame might be unbalanced if you're looking at the whole frame, but in a way it's not because you're blocking out half the frame with an object or a third of the frame or whatever. I like something that cuts the frame and focuses the audience's attention in a way on something you want them to be looking at and simplifies the frame, but also maybe creates the idea of a threat, creates the idea of somebody watching or all those things only really relate to the scene and the shot you're doing. You can't say the shot on somebody, the back of somebody's head has a specific meaning because it only means what it does relative to the scene. The person's emotions, the audience is making up what that person is feeling, but you're not saying what that person is feeling unless you know the script and you know the reason to do it. So
there's no hard and fast rules that
I don't think there is really. I mean, I don't think, as I was saying about the scene in Sicario of the conversation, I don't think it's necessarily stronger to be on a close-up for a scene than it is a wide shot with tiny little figures. It's all about context, I mean, you go back to Loveless and the way that plays sometimes.
It's also about your aspect ratio too, because your frame is a different size.
Yeah, it is. Aspect ratio. Yeah, that takes a role for sure. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the early choices you make, the aspect ratio, because it's a feeling of the film. And I don't know why. I couldn't write a paper on why one aspect ratio works for one film and doesn't for another. I don't know.
We are expecting you to write a paper on this.
Exactly. I mean, you can really say, I mean, people say, well, if it's a Western and wide open spaces, we got to do it, widescreen, CinemaScope, whatever, and you go, well, really? Do you? I don't know, really. I mean, The Lighthouse had a lot of exteriors. I'm probably not the best example, but you don't have to go to a widescreen just because it's a Western.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because something you've talked about these days, people are a lot more often just trying to make certain visual statements, whether they're stylistically or not, and not caring as much about the story. So they'll just shoot anamorphic to shoot anamorphic, or just shoot widescreen because they think they're supposed to shoot widescreen. I've been working on a lot of commercials that are asking me to shoot vertical because everyone's on their phones, they're on Instagram, they're on whatever.
Wow.
Now the aspect ratio is completely flipping and it's going 9:16. Mm-hmm. So you're having to now start thinking about different composition that's being framed vertically instead of horizontally. So it really depends on, I think, what you're showing and what you're trying to get the emotion across, right?
It's kind of exciting, really. I'm not sure I'd want to shoot a whole feature on a vertical widescreen frame, but it would be interesting. Got to think about it. Now, I suppose I'm from from Stills World and all that, so I kind of like the Academy frame, really, but there you go.
So when you start a project, do you usually start with that, or you
choose it early on?
Well, I talk with the director about it, and sometimes we don't have the same thing in mind. But I don't know why. It's just, I mean, you could say you want to be careful that the frame and the format and the whole style of the cinematography doesn't overpower story. And you might have a very quiet, delicate story, and then you shoot in widescreen with strong compositions with people on the side of frame, so the cuts are really dramatic when somebody is looking left and looking right, or maybe you short-sighted them the wrong way. Now, is that really right necessary for the subject? If it's a very quiet, intense, small piece and it's really about the characters, I think that's destructive myself. I'd like to see it work, but I haven't yet. On the other hand, it's pretty boring and sometimes on films where you just see everything is done so proscenium and exact, and you know they're doing it because it's easier that way. You can always cut. There's never any hard jump in the cut if everybody's in the same place in the frame. Like, you're doing a single and an over, and the person's always flipped exactly the same space in the frame. So, you know what I'm saying? The cut matches. And sometimes you don't want to do that. You want to make the audience jump. Jean-Pierre Melville was great with that. He used to jump the eye line. He'd be on a 3-shot or a 4-shot of a composition, and suddenly you'd be the other side of the room, completely cross the 180-degree rule. And you go, wow. And it was like, boom, it was like a shock to your system,
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. He was doing it deliberately. He wasn't stupid. He knew why he knew why he was doing it. And sometimes it can be very effective. Sometimes it can be very effective if you do that with much harder, with a close-up. Mm-hmm. Somebody's looking at somebody and you cut and they're not actually looking at each other because you're on the other side of the line. It can be kind of disturbing. But, I mean, it's fine if you know you're doing it.
You have to know what you're doing, too, because it can also just not work.
Yes, it can not work. And that's something I think every cinematographer needs to know, should know, needs to know, because the director is not always aware of that.
Yeah.
The director's not always aware that the cut will jump if they change the eyeliner on a single, or they want an insert and suddenly it's the wrong side of the line, or they come back to a scene to shoot a pickup and it's suddenly they think, oh, it'd be great over here to see that window.
And I think also the angle of the eyeline, because a lot of times they're not aware that they're looking too far off camera or something. And if you're in a lot of close-ups, so you don't have that kind of reference recently, I think that can really mess up the scene. And of course, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about, did they read the line right?
Well, that's right. It's a difficult balance between kind of taking a frame and saying something with the frame, but allowing the cut to work smoothly. And most of the time, it's more important the cut works smoothly than the individual frame is perfect or interesting or dynamic, or, it's not. It's like we talked about photographers, and sometimes their work is so much more complex than you see a still frame in a movie. Well, they can be, because the audience, their viewers, have got a long time to study that frame. Well, in a movie, it's going by like literally a 25th of a second or whatever. It's gone, So you can't, that's got to flow. What I'm saying, the cuts have got to flow. The whole feel of the film's got to flow and not jump. And if you're cutting on compositions that don't really go together, you're taking the audience out of the story, aren't you?
To your point about kind of the uninteresting or being just choosing the same over the shoulders and reverting to all the same shots, how do you think you can break from that typical or boring composition? I mean,
well, on the other hand, though, I think it's a danger. I mean, I always thought, I've said this a million times to people, when I was shooting, rock and roll or rock videos and stuff, if the band was no good, you would move the camera as much as possible. But I was filming Muddy Waters once and I didn't want to move, or B.B. King or something. You don't move the camera, because why do you need to? Because that performance is so magnetic. You just want to look at that face and the guy. So I think that's a silly anecdote, but I think it does play to, if you're shooting a great performance, you don't want to move the camera in a way that's going to distract the audience from being in that character's mind, with that character, do you? So simplicity is the best way to go, really.
Sometimes those shots work for a reason, why they're
Yeah,
tried and
yeah.
tested.
You might be thinking, well, this shot by itself is boring, and I'm not doing anything with the camera. I'm just sitting there listening to this person talk, but it's fine. I mean, do an interview or doing a documentary. If the person's interesting, you don't suddenly get up and wander around them. Do you? I mean, you don't. Well, at least I never did.
Well, this is definitely another topic which we're going to be doing about camera movement. So don't go too far.
Yeah.
But I think we had talked about it a little bit, but 1917, one of the reasons why it seemed like it was fun and interesting from a shooting perspective, you got to break a lot of those rules. It wasn't, all right, they're having a conversation, I'm going to over the shoulder, go to the wide or doing reverses. And you had to be more creative with your composition. It wasn't like you could just, play by the rules kind of thing.
Yeah, but that's a really good point, because Sam and I talked about this and we said, it's not going to work if we feel we need to cut to a reaction, the whole thing doesn't work. He said, if we feel that, we got to restage the scene. If you're going to keep to this one methodology of this one camera move, this one shot, then it has to encompass everything you want the audience to see. So if somebody's speaking and you want to see them, you have to restage it if it doesn't work with a camera. I thought that was really interesting when he said that. And it actually applied to that first bunker scene where the guys are getting their orders. And we had staged it we had drawn it out in a way that was like kind of complicated, didn't feel kind of right. And he came in one day and said, no, we can't, because I need to see that. I need to see that line, or reaction, but I don't need to see that one. So I've got to do it in a different way. And then conversely, the actually opening shot, I came in one day and said, I don't think we're seeing what we want to see. We're trying to, in a way, be too clever. But actually, what you want to see is these two guys talking.
Right, yeah.
So we just stayed in front of them instead of doing something that was more complicated. So,
Yeah, that scene specifically, I mean, because you moved in at their backs to see the general or whatever he was.
Right.
And
they came around the table.
Right. But then you finish on them because you're seeing how they're taking this all in, and it's
right. So you've already seen the line from the general you needed. You've gone down to the map. You come up to him. He's turned around. That allows you to the two guys walk around the table. So now you see their reaction to what their mission is, and then using their move over to the side to get their guns and their bits supplies, that gives you the chance to arc around and come back. And as they exit, you see you have to have the general's last line at that point, which is, the bit of poetry.
Yeah.
So, it's all kind of thought out. And then as they exit, we did the pan to go out with them up into the world over their backs, which was definitely the way to go, because you wanted to see them once again emerging into the trench and the fact that it was like Earth. So it was all, it's interesting. It's composition, but it's camera move. It's positioning the camera to get a composition which informs the audience what you show the audience to show them. It might be at the end of that scene, it's the silhouettes of our main characters in the foreground, and the general at his table with his tea or whatever deeper. But actually, all the focus is on him, because he's the only one in any light, really. So it's all a kind of thing that works together.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have worked if let's say the frame, the composition you want on their backs and the general, and then of the map, and then of just their reactions. If you had moved the camera quickly and all these big moves, then you wouldn't have had the same impact. So like you said, it is
right. You would have destroyed the moment if you didn't have this. I mean, a lot of those scenes, we wanted the camera to feel like a solid, relentless kind of move. We wanted it, you know what I mean? It was just something that just felt, we didn't want a handheld kind of active thing. It was just this relentless move with these characters. So.
It's like slow tension.
Yes. Yeah, it is, I think. It's a slow build up, the slow push into their faces, and they look up and then they walk off to the get their supplies. And you don't want the move just to be for the sake of it. And I thought it was really clever when Sam came in that day and said, okay, we'll have 2 tables and the mat won't be on the wall, it'll be on the table. And immediately it made sense. It felt kind of formal and simple, but then you go, yes, but that's what we need. You don't need a lot of, complex set design and stuff. It was a very simple, formal scene. But the whole film was very, very simple, really. It is a hard thing to talk about. I mean, I could, I suppose, research a load of, you could have a whole book full of frames and say, well, I like this and the reason is this and the reason is that. But everybody's going to have a slightly different reaction. And I think it's something you gradually learn yourself when you look at paintings or you take a lot of images and you just kind of feel what one means, because of its composition. What effect does that different composition have on you,
Yeah, it's like any of these things. You just have, like you said, you have to go out and do it. I remember when I started 10 years ago, whatever, I picked up a camera and I just started taking pictures of stuff. I didn't like it and I didn't know why, but once you start studying, you're like, well, I didn't like that, but I know what I did like, and I go look at that and I start seeing why I liked it, and you realize, oh, he's using negative space, or then you start learning about the rule of thirds and why it works and why you can break it, and just every time you do something new, you realize why you can, or how you can make an image that you might like a little bit more. So it's just a slow process of doing it again and again and failing and finding what you like.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's got, at some point, you've got to be in touch with your own intuition, if you like, in a way. You know what I mean? You can, but it's not really good on a set when you don't have a lot of time to be there and be seen to be considering something too much. Carney Hall used to tell me, he was used to, when nothing was happening, he'd be looking through the eyepiece and people would think he was concentrating on what was in front of him, but he wasn't. He said he was just thinking what the hell he was doing and what he wanted to do on the next shot or something, It's very hard to make that time for yourself. I don't smoke now, but I used to when I started. I used to roll my own cigarettes. So I'd stand in a corner and I'd be rolling my cigarette and the AD would say, are you ready yet? I said, well, I'm just doing this. But I didn't have to think about rolling the cigarette. I was thinking what I was doing as I was rolling the cigarette. It gave me that little moment of time. No, we can't. Before we break up, I'm just looking at the light. The sun's come out. It's been raining here for days, it seems, weeks even. But now the sun's come out. It's going down. It's coming through that window. If I took a shot of that room and I exposed for where the sunlight is, basically everything else would be pretty black, right? And that's also composition, isn't it? You can't divorce one thing from the other. Even in your room, if you're not going out, we're in lockdown. There's so much you can do just by looking at the light and how it affects things. And, I say the shadow of the window on the carpet and the floor there, you could take a million different shots of it and they will all express something a little bit differently, wouldn't they?
Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. See you next time.